All right, so the House and Senate have been debating a bill that is called the CHIPS Act, which in theory, at least, is supposed to bolster domestic manufacturing in specifically the semiconductor industry so that we're not as reliant on supply chains from China and Taiwan, etc. So in theory, it's a good bill at face value, but unfortunately, when you get into the details, and I covered this in a previous video about a month ago, when you get into the details of this bill, it turns out it's essentially just a slush fund for multinational billion-dollar corporations with no actual legitimate guardrails in place to make sure that they're spending these billions of dollars that we're about to give them on actual domestic manufacturing, or that they don't spend them on buybacks, or that they're not, massive union busters, for example. And so Bernie Sanders was attempting to introduce a bunch of different amendments to tackle those different issues and make sure basically that this bill just does what it's explaining that it's supposed to do, right? Bolster domestic manufacturing, create good paying, sustainable union jobs here in the country. And I wanted to get into the actual votes in terms of what this legislation turned out to be in the Senate, because they just did their official vote tallying on all of these different amendments. But first, let's hear from Bernie Sanders basically explaining why he was trying to introduce these guardrails in the first place.
No one disagrees that we need to manufacture more microchips here in the United States, but we should not be providing a $53 billion blank check to the highly profitable microchip industry with no protections for the American taxpayer. The 5 companies that will likely receive the lion's share of this funding, Intel, Texas Instruments, Samsung, Micron Technology, and Global Foundries, made over $75 billion in profits last year and spent over $18 billion on stock buybacks. Mr. President, we have strange priorities here in the Senate. We can't extend the child tax credit to combat child poverty. We can't deal with the crisis in child care. We can't provide dental care to seniors on Medicare. We can't deal with climate change, but somehow we can provide a massive amount of corporate welfare to a handful of corporations. The motion I'm offering today would instruct the conferees to impose the following conditions on companies receiving this assistance. They must agree to issue warrants or equity stakes to the federal government. If private corporations are going to benefit from $53 billion in taxpayer welfare, the financial gains must be shared with the American people, not just wealthy stockholders. Further, these companies must agree to not buy back their own stock, not outsource American jobs, not repeal existing collective bargaining agreements, and remain neutral in union organizing efforts. Mr. President, what we're talking about here is not a radical idea. These exact conditions, word for word, were included in the bipartisan CARES Act, which passed the Senate 96-0.
All right, so listen, at face value, every single thing that he was just talking about there, introducing these amendments, all of those different ideas make complete sense from the perspective of average Americans, or from the perspective of American taxpayers. So number one, he suggested that the government take an equity stake in these companies. Obviously, yes, we should be doing that. We shouldn't be giving $53 billion in welfare to corporations who are already making, as he said there, billions and billions of dollars in profit every single year, and they're using those profits on stock buybacks to just enrich their shareholders. So of course, the American people, if we're going to give them these billions of dollars to bolster American manufacturing in the semiconductor industry, we should get a stake in those companies so that we at least have a proportionate, reward for the money that we are doling out to these billion-dollar corporations. So that was one of them. The other one is basically don't be completely hostile to unions, right? And don't export your jobs overseas. Again, just very fundamental things that the overwhelming majority of the country would agree with. But unfortunately, largely due to the lack of coverage of this from the mainstream media and for other reasons, average Americans are not going to be aware of the nuances in this bill. They're not going to be aware that there's basically no guardrails to ensure that this money we're about to give them, this corporate slush fund that we're about to give to these billion-dollar companies, is actually used on the thing that it says that the bill is intended to do. So they're going to pass this, or arguably they have essentially already passed this, basically based on the voting tallies that we've gotten so far. But they're going to pass this, and they're going to parade themselves around acting like this is some big win for average working class Americans when it's just not. It's just a corporate welfare program for some of the wealthiest corporations in the country. So we're going to get to the vote tallies on some of these different amendments that were introduced, and really it just gets bleaker and bleaker as you go on. But here are just a little bit more details on some of these companies that are going to be getting this money. So here from Lever News, formerly the Daily Poster, they say microchip companies like Intel are hardly cash-strapped paupers that desperately need a bill providing $52 billion of federal subsidies in order to build factories in the United States. So they already have the money to do this if they actually wanted to do it. But they say, according to a study by the Institute for New Economic Thinking, Intel and 4 other wildly profitable American semiconductor giants that stand to benefit from the bill were so awash in cash that they spent nearly $250 billion in the last decade. $250 billion, or 70% of their profits on stock buybacks. So again, they're not taking the profits that they're making off of the backs of their workers and reinvesting that in American manufacturing, or even reinvesting it in the company. They're using 70% of it, okay? 70% of their profits, nearly $250 billion. Who knows, how many programs that Bernie Sanders was just mentioning there that $250 billion could have funded over that same time period, but nearly $250 billion just to inflate their stock price to reward their shareholders, okay? So this is where they're dumping their money right now. Who's to say that if you give them a $53 billion blank check that they're not going to turn around and use that money for the exact same goddamn reason, especially if you're not introducing the guardrails to ensure that they're actually spending it on that. So, that's why Bernie Sanders was making that point there, but they continue saying that those buybacks diverted money from capital investments and into stock price boosts that enriched shareholders and executives, and Intel and the microchip industry did this while moving manufacturing jobs away from the US over the past 3 decades. So they are looting the American taxpayer for billions of dollars in subsidies as they ship American jobs overseas and use virtually all of the profits that they are making off of the backs of their workers on enriching their shareholders. So that's the dynamic that Bernie Sanders was trying to attempt to put some guardrails in place to prevent this dynamic from continuing. And what are the results from that? Well, here from Craig Kaplan, who was keeping track with all of these amendment vote tallies. So again, just gets bleaker and bleaker as you go on, but on 2 of the main amendments that Bernie was putting forward here, from a 6 to 87 vote, okay, 6 in favor, 87 against, so the Senate rejected Sanders' motion to instruct their negotiators with the House that semiconductor manufacturing companies receiving federal aid in the science and tech research funding bill don't block their employees from unionizing and outsourcing their jobs. So 6 to 87, assuming these 6, and this is being very generous, are all Democrats, let's just assume that the overwhelming majority of the Democratic Party rejected an amendment that would have protected unionizing workers and protected workers from having their jobs outsourced overseas. So again, as all of these different Republicans and Democrats pretend to be populist and pretend to care about bolstering American manufacturing in the semiconductor industry for working class Americans to create these jobs, they're not even willing to accept an amendment. In fact, they overwhelmingly rejected an amendment to just guarantee that they're not going to be union busters and that they're not going to ship these jobs overseas. So completely pathetic, failed in a 6 to 87 vote on this one. And then another one here failed in a 17 to 78 vote here. So again, majority of Democrats and Republicans rejected this. The Senate rejected Sanders' motion to instruct conferees on the science and technology research bill to cut funding for NASA lunar lander program. So this was essentially that $10 billion handout to Jeff Bezos to go fly around on his dildo rocket in space. Bernie was trying to say, why the fuck are we giving Jeff Bezos $10 billion for nothing? And essentially they struck down that amendment as well, along with basically the rest of all of those amendments that he was talking about in that video we just watched. Now we get to some of the amendments that they approved. Well, of course, there's always going to be bipartisan consensus on serving the interests of corporate America, on serving the interests of the military-industrial complex, and that's exactly what we saw here. So in a 53 to 44 vote, the Senate approved Wyoming GOP Senator Barrasso's motion to instruct requiring a minimum number of oil and gas leases through 2027. First off, what the fuck does that have to do with the intent of this legislation of bolstering domestic semiconductor manufacturing? They're literally just throwing these amendments there and squeezing them past in this Senate that, again, is controlled by the Democratic Party, and successfully introducing, in this case, an amendment to bolster our investments in oil and gas leases for these billion-dollar fossil fuel companies that we already know are price gouging the American people right now, drastically and artificially raising gas prices at the gas pump for you and your families at the expense of the American people, and just to enrich their shareholders. So yeah, they successfully passed an amendment to to get more oil and gas leases through 2027, locking us into this downward spiral with climate change. And that's not the only climate change related provisions. So, but we'll get to a couple of those here in a second. We also had this one that passed 86-12. Okay, again, Democrats participating in this. Senate approves Texas GOP Senator Ted Cruz's motion to instruct the Senate negotiators on the science and tech bill that terrorism-related sanctions on Iran are necessary to limit cooperation between Iran and China. So again, what the fuck does this have to do with increasing domestic manufacturing of microchips within the United States? It has nothing to fucking do with that, but this is the type of thing that gets passed in a bipartisan consensus. Overwhelmingly, 86-12 voted to approve terrorism-related sanctions on Iran and saying that they're necessary. What are we even doing here? I mean, this is just completely pathetic and embarrassing, but this is exactly why Congress has a, 19-20% approval rating, is because of shit like this. And finally here, or just one more here, we got another one after this. In a 50-44 vote, the Senate approved Tom Cotton from Arkansas's motion to instruct their conferees to remove $8 billion for Green Climate Fund from the House Science and Tech bill and use instead for Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency for weapons systems to compete with China. So they literally passed, and again, in a Democratic-controlled Senate, they managed to pass an amendment while they're simultaneously rejecting protecting unionized workers, while they're simultaneously rejecting protecting these jobs from being outsourced, while they're rejecting this amendment from Bernie Sanders to not give a $10 billion handout to Jeff Bezos. They're simultaneously accepting things like this, where they are literally removing investments in green climate funds, in green technology, and substituting that and giving that $8 billion to DARPA, okay? Giving that to DARPA to manufacture weapon systems to compete with China in Cold War II electric boogaloo. I mean, again, what the fuck are we doing? This is a perfect demonstration on how, when it comes to legislation that could actually be legitimate and good, in the case of, investing in bolstering domestic manufacturing in microchips and semiconductors, I support that if it was actually done correctly. But clearly, they don't give a shit about actually doing things on behalf of the American people, tackling climate change. They only care about creating a bipartisan consensus around serving the interests of corporate America, and again, clearly serving the interests of the military-industrial complex. $8 billion diverted from a green climate fund to fucking DARPA for Cold War II electric boogaloo. Completely pathetic. Finally, the last one here, 49-47, the Senate narrowly approves Capito's motion to instruct conferees on this bill to clarify the president cannot use climate change as the basis to declare a national emergency. Okay, and Mark Kelly, and Joe Manchin joined Republicans in voting yes. So of course, Joe Manchin, absolute corporate ghoul, coal baron millionaire from West Virginia, who has direct financial ties to the fossil fuel industry, is participating in this Republican-led amendment to basically not allow Joe Biden to declare a climate emergency. There's no other emergency that could possibly take precedence over climate change right now. It's completely, anti-science. It's completely against the interests of the American people, against the interests of humanity in general. But of course, this is the type of guy who Democrats are letting set essentially their entire legislative agenda. I mean, this is a guy who Joe Biden is not willing to come out and even mention the fact that he's corrupt or get into the details of his corrupt financial ties to the fossil fuel industry. And he's able to come in here and successfully participate in getting amendments passed that are literally nothing but a disservice to the future of humanity while serving the interests of the same exact industries that he profits from on a daily basis. So listen, I mean, this is completely pathetic. Obviously, Bernie Sanders was completely right to introduce these amendments. I mean, I don't know how you could possibly disagree with giving the American people an equity stake in billion-dollar corporations that we are giving them infinite sums of money. I don't know how you could possibly disagree with protecting unionizing workers or making sure that these jobs are not shipped overseas. I don't know how you could possibly think that Jeff Bezos deserves a $10 billion slush fund to go ride around on his dildo rocket in space. So on all of those different substantive points, Bernie Sanders was 100% correct. And on all of those different substantive points, corporate Democrats teamed up with Republicans to make sure that this bill only serves the interest of corporate America, these billion-dollar corporations who don't give a single shit about creating good, stable union jobs for the future of America. All they care about is extracting as much profit from their workers as they possibly can, while, exporting jobs overseas, enriching their shareholders, etc., and also obviously serving the interests of the military-industrial complex.